Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the really complex and honestly often misunderstood story of the relationship between Native American nations and the United States during the late 19th century. It's a story filled with diplomacy, broken promises, and ultimately brutal conflict that literally reshaped an entire continent.
Okay, so where do we even begin? Let's start by tackling the story that a lot of us grew up with about the American West. You know the one, this idea that was all about progress and settling a vast, empty land. But, as you're about to see, the real history is so much more complicated than that.
And this slide, wow, it really lays it all out, doesn't it? On the one hand, you've got the myth, this civilizing mission into a so-called empty West. But the historical record? It shows a completely different picture. We're talking about a land that was home to numerous sovereign Indian nations. These were distinct political groups, mind you, fully capable of making their own treaties. And their removal, well, that was achieved through straight-up conquest.
So before all the major wars really kicked off, the first approach by the US government was actually to recognize these native nations and make treaties with them. It was a period of diplomacy, an attempt to draw lines on a map and figure out how to coexist.
And here, you can see a couple of these major attempts at diplomacy in action. You've got the Treaty of Medicine Lodge in 1867, which carved out a huge area that would become Indian territory. Then, just a year later, the Treaty of Fort Laramie created the Great Sioux Reservation. This was a really big deal. It actually ended a war by granting this massive territory to the Lakota Sioux and Arapaho.
And here's the absolutely crucial point about that treaty. It wasn't just some vague promise. It specifically, legally, granted the Sioux exclusive rights to the Black Hills. This was a binding agreement between nations, a promise that, as we'll see, was about to be seriously tested and then completely broken. So what happened to that era of diplomacy? Well, under President Ulysses S. Grant, things started to shift big time. The whole idea of treating native nations as equals you negotiate with, that began to fade away, and a much more forceful approach took its place. This new policy basically laid down a stark choice. You could either abandon your entire traditional way of life and go live on a reservation, or you could give up your tribal identity completely and try to assimilate. This just fundamentally changed the whole dynamic from one of mutual agreement to one of demands being enforced by the US government.
And this is where you get a massive disconnect. You had some reformers, like the Secretary of the Interior, Carl Schurz, who were genuinely trying to stop corruption. But the problem was, the whole policy was being carried out by people who, for the most part, saw Native Americans as lesser than. So even if the stated goal was protection, the prejudice of the people on the ground just totally undermined it.
Just think about the incredible pressure this created. Native nations weren't just up against one opponent. It was like a three-front war. You had settlers constantly pushing onto their land, a government in Washington, D.C. making policies, and then the full military might of the U.S. Army showing up to enforce it all.
And this was the tipping point. Remember that promise about the Black Hills? Just 7 years later, gold was discovered there, and that promise was shattered. Thousands of prospectors flooded in, and the government either couldn't or wouldn't stop them. This is what lit the fuse for one of the most famous conflicts in American history.
So with treaties being ignored and the government's policy shifting to brute force, the stage was set. This wasn't just one war, but a whole series of brutal conflicts that erupted all across the West as native nations fought to defend everything they had. And this timeline is really just a snapshot of the chaos. From Sand Creek down in Colorado all the way up to the northern plains, fighting was just a constant reality. I mean, get this, in the year 1871 alone, there were more than 100 recorded battles and skirmishes.
Of course, there's the one everyone's heard of, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. And it was an absolutely stunning victory for the combined tribal forces, a moment where they decisively beat a well-known unit of the U.S. Army. But, and this is a huge but, it would be their last major victory. The U.S. government's response was swift and overwhelming.
Meanwhile, another incredible, tragic story was unfolding up north. The Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, refused to be forced onto a reservation. Instead, they began an unbelievable fighting retreat, covering over 1,000 miles, trying to make it to safety in Canada. The Army, under General Nelson Miles, chased them relentlessly until they were finally cornered, exhausted, just miles from the border.
And his words, spoken at his surrender, they just say it all. They captured this profound sense of exhaustion, of sorrow. It wasn't just about losing a battle.
It was about losing a whole world.
That feeling in Chief Joseph's words, that sense of an ending, that was the reality playing out across the entire West. With the major tribes either defeated or forced to surrender, U.S. military control was basically total. The era of the big wars was over. The American frontier was officially declared closed.
But closed definitely did not mean peaceful. You still had these last desperate acts of resistance. Geronimo and his Apache warriors fought on in the Southwest until 1886. And then there was the Ghost Dance, a spiritual movement that ended in the horrific massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. The fight wasn't completely over, but large-scale resistance was broken.
Now look at this number, 2 million. That's how many acres of land that was supposed to be Indian territory forever, the government just gave away to white settlers in a single day. This wasn't a slow trickle. This was a floodgate opening. It was the final, decisive act.
So the bottom line here is this. The famous closing of the frontier wasn't some natural, peaceful process. It didn't happen because people just ran out of land to explore. It was the direct result of a military and political conquest that pushed the original inhabitants off their ancestral homelands. And that's really the question to leave you with. When we move past the simple myths and look at the complicated, often brutal reality, it doesn't just change how we see the past. It helps us make sense of the present, because the legacy of this period is still shaping the United States today.